And we're live. Welcome to the Evil Tester Show. I don't have a jingle yet. I'll need to add a jingle. So we're concentrating on software testing in this podcast, particularly software testing with a different attitude. Because that's one of the things I think is really important in software testing. Changing your attitude as a tester to focus on risk and doing pretty much whatever it takes to add value into that project, on that team, at that point in time for that piece of functionality, whatever you're currently doing. Get an attitude that helps you explore that system, target its risks, and test as well as humanly possible, or at the very least as well as you can. So in this episode, I'm going to cover provocative therapy and a tester's role in modern software development. These two things to me are related. Provocative therapy is one of the subjects that I studied earlier on in my career, which has really helped me develop an attitude towards testing. And I think it's really important, so I'm going to go through that. Now remember, you can find the show notes for this podcast at eviltester.com/show. And this podcast is listed in iTunes, so you should be able to subscribe in your favorite podcasting app, or you can watch it on YouTube. Again, all the links that I mentioned in this show will be mentioned on eviltester.com/show, which is the show notes. So provocative therapy. Provocative therapy is a book. It's a book about therapy. It's written by Frank Farley and Jeff Brandsma. It was written in 1974. I can't really stress how important this book has been to developing my attitude towards software development, software testing, and consultancy. It's one of the books that I do mention in Dear Evil Tester, in the references in Dear Evil Tester, because it's fundamental to how I actually approach testing. And every podcast I'm going to try and do some sort of book review or some sort of pointer towards a book, because I think there's an awful lot to learn outside of the realms of software testing. And just looking around the office, I have so many books here I would love to be able to share with you. I'm going to try and pick them one at a time. It's like, I don't know, 1,000 shows we're going to have to get through. So provocative therapy. Where to start with this? This book is so important. The therapist in here, Frank Farley, studied a lot of different therapy types. He was very influenced, according to his own notes in here, by Carl Rogers. So the reason I'm explaining this now is that very often we're describing tester roles and we're talking about coaches, and pretty much everyone that studies coaching now reads Carl Rogers, person-centered therapy. And that helped Frank Farley get inside the head of the patient that he was working with to try and build up some empathy towards it, to build up a model of how that patient sees the world, to then understand that patient and the world as a system from the patient's perspective, not an external therapist perspective. And that helped Frank. But then Frank kind of moved beyond that to adopt a more challenging attitude, possibly because of the way that he was brought up with Franciscan monks or nuns or whomever else he was being taught by. What you find with therapies is they're very often so focused on the individual therapist in the very early days. Then very often they get systematized and we have terms that come through with them. But if you read the early works from therapists, it's very often very associated with their personality and their approach to therapy, because they're working one-on-one with people. Their personality has to come through. They have to adopt and take responsibility for whatever therapy they're using. If they don't, then you run the risk that you're just asking a set of questions. Frank Farley describes that pretty well in the early part of this book, where he's just taking a standard question approach and he runs out of questions. He doesn't really add any value and he doesn't know what to say next. And he decides, I'm never going to allow that to happen to me again. So he develops more versatility, more variety in how he approaches and works with clients. That's an important lesson. How to categorize provocative therapy. So one of the precepts in here is that very often therapies take the view that a patient cannot change. One of the statements in here is that it's less about they cannot change and they will not change. But sometimes it's about they do not yet have the resources to allow themselves to change. And parts of provocative therapy are about dealing with the patient in such a way that they take responsibility for and stand up for themselves, and then learn to draw on the resources they have and use them in a different way rather than the habitual processes that they work with when working with the world. So it makes the assumption that people can change quickly that the therapist can aid that very fast. So this forms into one of the kind of brief therapy approaches. This makes the assumption that people make sense. The human animal is exquisitely logical and understandable. That means we can build a model of the person. We can treat the person as a system. We can model it. Then, as we go through therapy, we ask questions. We make challenging statements to test how well our model of that person matches them, matches their reality. Because if we've got a model of the person, we can project that forward, see how they'll handle certain situations. We can test that. We can help them take risks that we believe are safe given the model that we've built for that person, which they might not yet believe, and encourage them to explore and experiment more and give them more choices and options. So in here, Frank describes the role of the provocative therapist. And we're going to cover the role of the tester in modern software development later, so I thought that was relevant. In here, Frank Farley says that the therapist has goals. Some of the goals are to affirm the patient's self-worth, to allow the patient to assert themselves, to take responsibility for themselves, to defend themselves, because these are skills that we have to develop if we're going to survive in the real world. And the therapist is really helping the patient deal with the real world better, to give them strategies to cope with the world in the same way that, in quotes, normal people cope with the world. Now, things that have influenced my testing in particular is that Frank describes the role of the therapist as anything goes. In order to have a fighting chance in therapy and deal with the patient or system that is in front of you, you have to be capable of doing things that you wouldn't normally do. So pretty much anything goes in terms of, are you getting the results or behavior in terms of meeting the goals that you have set out for therapy? Now I approach that in terms of testing and consultancy. Goals being, can I get the information? Anything goes in terms of getting those information. I might crack jokes. I might make statements that I'm pretty sure are wrong so that people correct me. I might ask questions based on previous experience, but I'm not tied into a fixed set of questions. I'm trying to respond to the situation at hand. And because it's provocative therapy, one of the statements in here is that it's about provocative communication, which sometimes means taking a devil's advocate approach, saying things that people might not think are true, therefore they defend themselves, projecting what you believe people already believe about themselves to an extreme, so again that they have to deny that or defend themselves or justify it, in which case you learn more about their model. But because the therapist is trying to maintain a relationship, very often it has to be done with humour, so that it's not an attack, although sometimes Frank Farley does engage in direct provocation, which is almost an attack. But essentially we're trying to express the unutterable, feel the unfeelable, think the unthinkable, and put the patient into a situation where they have to understand and defend that. One of the interesting things here is it also says non-verbal acceptance of the client, which is very much comes back to that Carl Rogers approach. But when I'm doing consultancy or when I'm working with teams, that is key. Non-verbal acceptance of the client. It's not a judging thing. We accept currently what is going on. We accept the system as it currently is. We model it as it currently is. We try not to judge it, and we try to look at where do we go from here. In order to do that, we have to understand what here means and try and avoid making too many assumptions in there. So then there's a discussion of humour in here. I've noticed I try and use humour quite a lot in consultancy. I mean, it helps put people at their ease, but also helps point out things which are plainly wrong in a way that everyone acknowledges the wrong, but it's not a judgmental way. We know that what we're doing is not working. Therefore, we laugh about it, which helps us put it as a distance and identify it as something we want to change. In here, Frank Farley says, it's often been necessary to remind students that if the client is not laughing during at least part of the therapeutic encounter, the therapist is not doing provocative therapy. And what he is doing may at times turn out to be destructive. Humour plays a central, crucial, key role in provocative therapy. It is encouraged and necessary. It is not just a tangential adjunct to the real work. There are a lot of really useful stories and lessons in here, but fundamentally this focuses on the attitude of the therapist, the skills they're going to need, harnessing the therapist's unique abilities, right? Because everyone has a different sense of humour, everyone communicates in a different way, everyone has to be congruent with themselves, therefore you need to harness people's individually, and that really comes across strongly in here. This is a very easy to read book. There's not a lot of psychological terms. There's a very small bibliography in the back, so if you want to pursue the references, you can do. It's very capable. This is a good intro into psychotherapy, but it's also a massively useful intro into coaching and therapy and consultancy, which is good because now we're going to cover the role of the tester. And this podcast is sponsored by Compendium Developments Limited, which is my company, a bespoke software testing and development company based just outside London. And I help you improve your software testing and development process. So if you're trying to work with Agile, you're trying to work with exploratory testing, technical testing, improve your team's ability to do more technical testing, even if it's the developers, it doesn't matter who's doing the testing, improve the testing on your project and the development, make everything work better. That's what I help you do. So tester's role in modern software development. The reason I'm discussing this is I see this come up online a lot. Because it seems as though in the wider world, we're starting to view testers as possibly being more coaches and advisors. And I want to discuss that a bit. Not because I think I have absolute answers, but I worry that people are jumping to solutions that might seem like a good idea for them or how they fit into a project, but not necessarily looking at the nuances, not necessarily seeing how this applies to everyone. Because we know that testing is a key skill set. It's hard. Not everyone can test well. Same is true for coaching, mentoring, consultancy. These are skill sets. And if we're concerned that testing isn't working in an organization particularly well, and we haven't necessarily looked at the reasons for that to occur, if we then adopt the view we should make all our testers coaches, that might not be solving the problems that we have, and you might be creating a whole new set of problems, and you might be setting the testers that you move into a coaching role up to fail because they might be better as testers than coaches. And this is a hard topic. But what I find interesting is the notion of the tester's role itself. If testers are confused about the role, then why would we expect anyone else to understand it? Right? Fundamentally, we have to understand what it is we do. And roles come with expectations, and they're often external expectations. We expect programmers to be able to program better than other people in the project. Similarly, we expect managers to be able to manage better than other people in the project, analysts to analyze better than other people in the project, designers to design, etc., etc. So we expect testers to test better than other people in the project. And other people in the project can test. They should test. They will test, but they can test, and recognizing that the tester's role is about testing better. Because other people can test, we might then take the view that, well, the tester's role is to help other people test better. And that is probably part of the dynamics that are required on a system. But that doesn't necessarily mean it is the tester's role exclusively to do that, because then we're not really harnessing the skill set of that tester. Now, if testers are not testing better on projects than other people, it might be that testers simply are not needed, right? The project might be doing really well. It might be that other people are testing and the tester is simply repeating the same work. It might be that the testers are not good enough because they're not seeing opportunities to test. It might be that something is stopping them from testing really well. And it might be something else. It might be a whole bunch of reasons why we're not harnessing a tester's capability on a project. So we might want to conduct experiments if we're making assumptions about what it is, rather than simply going, well, we'll make all our testers coaches so that they can help everyone test. Fundamentally, I don't like definitions, but I like to try and make descriptions of what I think are happening. And I think the tester's role is to find opportunities to test that other people don't see. That's what a tester does. And a good tester can take advantage of those opportunities better than other people. So it's not just identifying the opportunities, it's having the ability to use those opportunities, to recognize there's a risk, then pursue that risk with technical knowledge, with skill sets, with tools to really hammer that home. And that's where all the skills, experience, attitudes, techniques come in. And if we don't recognize that, and if we are unable to spot new opportunities, we might see that people who don't necessarily get associated with testing are finding opportunities to test. We may view those opportunities that they find as good enough. That's acceptable to us. That mitigates the risks that we're really concerned about. In that case, maybe you don't need testers because the opportunities that other people are finding are good enough for you. There are gaps in what you're doing, there are risks, but you might accept those as business risks and then everything's fine. Then you don't need testers because you've got other people doing the testing. You've just redefined the testing role. Now, a lot of this I think comes down also to Agile, because people think that Agile has changed the tester's role. Agile hasn't really changed the tester role. Agile has offered us a new system within which we have to work. So we have to work differently. What people think has changed are the trappings, the externally observable parts of the process that we wrap around testing. They've changed, hopefully, if you're doing Agile. But the actual role of testing, the actual skill sets haven't really changed, because internally for testing, we look for opportunities to test. Risk, functional coverage, system flows, whatever it is. We take full advantage of those opportunities through exploration, tooling, technical knowledge, making notes on what we do. Other people who are not testers will not take advantage of those. We communicate the results of having taken those opportunities, and we learn from those opportunities to generate more opportunities to test. That, in a nutshell, is kind of what testers do. That hasn't changed. That applies in Waterfall, Agile, Scrum, whatever you're doing. That is one way to look at testing. So why would we be confused about our role? I find this question hard to answer, but I fall back on experience. So I know that when I started on my first Agile project, I was confused. I wasn't necessarily confused about the role of testing. I was confused about my role on that project, because it was a small team. We were mostly doing TDD. We were working from stories. We were doing some pairing. We had kind of 2-week sprints. Go. Now do your Agile thing, fit into that team and go. You're the Agile tester. So I had to create my role. I had to understand the dynamics of that team and create a role that fit in there and added some value. So looking at TDD, I had to improve my programming. That was good for me. Right, that was beneficial to me long term. That improved my skill sets. I think it helped writing code, gave the programmers a different insight into how tester views code at an early point when it's being delivered. I think that was beneficial. Problem is, we weren't very good at estimating or planning, so we didn't always have time to pair and cover all the stuff we were going to do. Now, we didn't fix that. We didn't view that as a problem. Therefore, we changed our process and paired less and did TDD less. So I changed my role then so that I could hunt down risks and issues that other people were not concentrating on. I was looking for opportunities to test that other people were not finding. And I was taking advantage of those opportunities in ways that other people in the team did not. Now, we could have fixed that problem by estimating differently, putting less into the sprint and trying to work more tightly, but we didn't. So I changed my role to adopt to the circumstances on that project. In the planning sessions, the stories weren't very good. I didn't think they were very good, in the sense that there was a lot of ambiguity, which sometimes meant we built stories that weren't quite what the user wanted. The users weren't as involved as they could be, but we didn't fix that problem. So instead, I pointed out ambiguities. I asked questions and asked for clarification. So questions like, how will we know? How will we know that this is the right thing? How will we know we've done this? What happens if? When do we have to do this? When specifically does this occur? Can you give me an example? Can you elaborate on that example? Are there any more examples that are important? What does that imply? Right, all these type of questions I put into the planning process to tighten up those stories, to resolve the ambiguity, to try and make sure we were all on the same page and avoid finding the risk that we weren't later. Because a lot of this was risk focused. What I do when I'm working to define my role is look at the risks that I perceive happening and try and target those if I have the ability to do that. So I also wrote code to automate the execution of the applications that we could put in part of the build process, and I could use to support my testing. All of this was how I constructed my role. Now, you could generalize from that and go, well, an Agile tester does this. An Agile tester asks questions in the sprint. An Agile tester pairs with developers. An Agile tester tests early in the sprint. You could generalize to that. Some projects don't necessarily need that. I think it's more important to define your role based on your capabilities, your individual capabilities, skill sets and attitudes to work within that project. Then you might find there are risks because there are certain parts of the process that no one has taken up or adopted yet, and then you can choose to spread that across the team if that's recognized and acknowledged as a risk. Right? But we have to own the role, and we do that within the capabilities we have and the opportunities that we see. And we are individuals, so it will be different no matter how you generalize. Now, sadly, I think because of the confusion that testers have when we enter Agile projects, people get confused about testing on Agile projects. We see on Agile projects that programmers are doing more testing. That's a good thing. And they are testing and they are doing testing. They might not be identifying all the opportunities for testing that a good tester can identify. That's what a good tester is for, to identify the extra opportunity. But we have system dynamic issues. So sometimes if you've got testers and programmers on the team, programmers do less testing because you've got a tester who can do that. So even though the programmer can spot opportunities for testing, even though the programmer can take advantage of those opportunities. Very often, because we've got a tester, the system dynamics allow the programmers not to do that, and then the tester picks up the slack. But then you've got the issue that you usually have more programmers on team than testers. Therefore, testers don't have the time to do the stuff that only they can do. They're doing the stuff that other people could do, anyone could do, which means that they're picking off low-hanging fruit. They're not really going in depth. They don't have time for that. That's a risk. So very often testers are not using their full skill sets effectively within that environment, and their value is then obscured. People look at what they're doing, say, I could do that, why do we even need testers? Then the temptation is to get rid of the testers and say, we'll force the programmers to do all the testing by taking the testers out. Then we'll make the testers quality coaches or testing coaches, or SWAT teams to come in and help fix projects, or mentors or consultants, internal consultants, whatever you want to phrase it. They'll come into projects to help them identify the extra 20% or the stuff that the programmers aren't doing. But that also might mean that the programmers don't have the skill sets or capabilities to do that. And we've taken out the skill sets from the team. We have to be careful here. So we can change the system dynamics on a project by taking the testers out. Then that forces the remaining people on that team to do testing. Devil's advocate question, I think, is why do we need to create a new role to set up that dynamic? Why don't we just put that dynamic in there? Why didn't we do that before and then just have the tester fill in the gaps? What prevented the tester from filling in the gaps when the programmers were doing most of the testing? What makes us think that taking the people out, then putting them back in every so often will work better than just fixing the actual development process that is there and having people who have a testing focus in there all the time? I think we might be leaping to conclusions that because programmers can do this, because they work better on their own, we take people out, then we can put the advisory capabilities in, will work better. I haven't seen a lot of experiments of people doing that, and the notion that everyone you could pull out and turn them into a coach, I think demeans the notion of what a coach or a mentor or a consultant actually does. Now, I also get wary that we as an industry use words in ways that the dictionary definitions don't. Dictionary definitions for coach, mentor, and consultant are very, very similar. Right? A coach is an instructor, a trainer. A mentor is an experienced or trusted advisor. A consultant is a person who gives expert advice professionally. These are very, very similar definitions. Now, if you go on a coaching course, you will learn that a coach has a very rich role. There's very different ways of approaching it, but you're almost redefining the notion of coach to fit in with that industry sales pitch almost, which is fine, right? Coaches have a value. There's a very valid thing in there. But we have to recognize that it's a new role and it requires training. And with any role, not everyone is going to be suitable for it. Not everyone is going to have the attitude to do it. Not everyone is going to want to learn to do that. Not everyone is going to want to go and read Carl Rogers. Not everyone is going to want to go and read family therapy books and dynamics and personal dynamics. Some people just want to get on and do a particular job. So coaching might not be suitable for those people. Now, I'm not really going to discuss why I think a coach or a mentor or a consultant is different. What I want to do is look at the commonalities between there. So generally, we're saying we want someone with external experience to come into a team. They have to have the ability to ask questions that will trigger action or that will help them model the process to help us then decide on what to do next. They have to have the ability to suggest solutions, to suggest experiments. They have to have the ability to lead in a subtle fashion, right? Not a command and control fashion, but to pull the team together to help them go in a certain direction, to help people make decisions, to help people commit to the decisions, to help people recognize when the decisions are wrong, to help them do retrospectives, the ability to bring people to work together, to build. The list goes on and on. This is not necessarily an easy to define role or an easy thing to do. And clearly I think it's valid because I'm a consultant and I do similar activities when I go on projects, but also I've got years of experience. I've done a lot of training and studying for this work, and I wouldn't necessarily describe what I do in the same way as other coaches. I think it's a very individual approach. So if you're in an organization that is heading towards a coaching type thing, one thing we have to recognize is it's a different role. Therefore, are the people you're putting in that role getting the training they need? Do they have the requisite attitudes? Or are we treating them homogeneously? So even though the people have very different skill sets, we're going to evaluate them on the basis of a coach rather than their unique ability to add value into a project. That's what I get concerned about. People were doing a role, we couldn't figure out what that role is. Now they're a coach. We're not necessarily training them, we're setting them up to failure because it's a very different role and no one knows what to expect from that role. How do you know your coach is doing well? I mean, I don't think a lot of this has been thought through, so I get concerned. I think it's a harder path. Essentially, train your programmers to test. That's great. Train your testers how to coach. Train whoever is doing coaching in coaching. But this is actually a harder path. And part of the problem is I think that's actually a downer. Was that a downer? That sounded like a downer to me. So to turn this into a more positive ending, because I think there's a lot of positives here. There's no generic solutions here. Some people will make great coaches. Some people make great consultants. If they can, great. But some people will be able to fit into a team and craft a role that adds value. And if they can do that, great. Use that. Don't treat people homogeneously. Don't assume that every tester has to now be a coach. I mean, people have argued for years, not all testers are good at test automation. That's true. So we don't force them to do that. The same is going to happen when we start discussing coaching or quality mentoring or whatever else we call it. Recognize instead that people are individuals, that teams are a group of individuals working together, harnessing their unique skills in ways that gel and blend. Now, I lost a job interview very early in my career because this is what I believed about teams then. The organization believed that teams were homogeneous people who fit into roles that did what they were told and followed a process. I'm concerned that when we start discussing quality coaches that we're heading down that path again. Then the emphasis becomes responsibility for the individual. So as an individual, identify what your skill sets are, identify what you are good at, identify what your attitude is, identify how you work with people and figure out how to harness that. What makes you different? And if you see that you're not adding your uniqueness, your individuality into a team, figure out what to do about that so that you can. Is it the processes? Is it the way you're working? Is it the way that you've chosen to interpret the processes? If so, try something different. Do whatever it takes. Develop a different attitude, because then whatever happens, you will be able to make the most of it because you are approaching this as an individual and harnessing all your skill sets. I think that's much more of an upper, because I think it puts the responsibility and emphasis back on each one of us to change what we do and the way we do it and to act as individuals the best that we can. So remember, all the show notes are on evotester.com/show. I'll see you in the next episode.